Welcome back, everyone, to our weekly discussion of the Haftara. And I want to start with an admission this week. My first reaction to this week's Haftara was one of disappointment, to be honest with you. I know many of the Haftaras in advance, but yesterday I found myself flipping to the Haftara and thinking, ooh, Korban Pesach is a big deal in this week's parsha. Maybe we'll read about Korban Pesach in the time of Yoshua, or things like that, or maybe we'll read about Makas Bechoros. And, when I got to Yirmiyahu Mem Vav, it looked very, very similar to last week's Haftara. It's the section of Yirmiyahu where there are all these prophecies, nevuot, about the Goyim. And, there's a difficult nevuah about Mitzrayim, but it's Mitzrayim. And that's exactly what we read last week in Yechezkel, a nevuah about Mitzrayim. And the future of Mitzrayim is not that bright. Okay, we know that. They're bad people. But why the point? Why have to do it again? And I was thinking, presumably, if I know this, Chazal know this. And why did Chazal choose to pick another nevuah about Mitzrayim as opposed to other possibilities which could have existed in the parsha? And it dawned on me. Chazal may have picked the two Haftoros, Yechezkel for Parshas Va'era and Yirmiyahu for Parshas Bo, together. And it could be that Chazal see a theme in the Haftoros, and they want to make sure we see that same theme. Here's a good example, right? There are, Shiva de Nechemta, the 7 Haftoros after Tisha B'Av, 7 Haftoros of consolation. Now, if I tell you there's one theme to those Haftaras, you'll agree with me. Of course there is. Because the Haftaras have nothing to do with the Parsha. And we know that that's the case. Maybe they increase in their level of consolation. I think that's Tosas Shita. But it doesn't matter. That's the theme. Right? But it turns out, or at least I'm suggesting, that maybe that's the case with regular Haftaras as well. Maybe it's the case that Chazal want us to see what we saw in last week's Haftara about Bo, and to see similar ideas, although different ideas, in the Haftara of Parshas Va'era. Because Bo and Va'era, continue the same narrative, right? 7 Makos in last week's Parsha, 3 Makos in this week's Parsha. There is a continuation, but as we pointed out last week, based on an idea from Moshe Lichtenstein, there are different themes. Right? What was the theme of last week's Parsha? The theme of last week's Parsha is V'yadu ki ani Hashem. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu comes to Paro, and the idea originally is he wants to take Bnei Yisrael out of Mitzrayim, and Paro says, and it's a mistake for Paro to say this, Lo yadati et Hashem, v'gam et Yisrael lo ashaleach. I don't know God. I don't recognize God. And so all of a sudden, the shlichut of Moshe changes, right? The point is not just to take Bnei Yisrael and Mitzrayim. The focus in Parshas Va'era is on Paro and Mitzrayim recognizing and acknowledging HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? And so when you look at last week's Makos, certainly the first one, Dam, Tzvadeh, and Kinim, but even as they go on, they're distractions and they're difficult, but they're not destructive. They're not going to end Mitzrayim, right? There doesn't seem to be, a tension, or there doesn't seem to be a real rush on the part of Moshe Rabbeinu, or on the part of Paro, to get rid of the Makos. Paro often, says, Moshe says, when do you want me to get to the Makkah? And Paro says, Limachar. And Moshe says, fine, I'll do it tomorrow. Leman Teda ki ani Hashem b'kerev haaretz, right? The purpose is, you should internalize the idea that Hashem exists and that Hashem is active in the world. When Hashem wants something in the world, He's going to be involved in world affairs, He's going to be involved in world politics, and He's going to achieve the result. And so, Dam tzvadei akinim arav dever shchin barad, right? I'm not saying they're not serious Makos, and they certainly get increasingly more serious. But the future of Mitzrayim is not on the line, right? Even if something bad is happening in Mitzrayim, the future of Mitzrayim is kind of assured. And the fact that Mitzrayim is a superpower, right, you know that. But the purpose is to get Paro to recognize, I'm not letting Bnei Israel go because of the Makos. I'm letting them go because of God. That also explains why the whole 3-day thing, right? Why does Moshe have to mislead Paro and say, Nel Chana, Shlosh Shanim Ba'midbav Mizbechal Hashem Elokeinu, right? The point is, if Paro lets them go to worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there must be HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There must be a God. So it's almost like a theological struggle between Paro and HaKadosh Baruch Hu over the existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And when Paro says, after Barad, which is the last Makkah in last week's Parsha, and Paro says, Hashem HaTzadik ve'ani harishaim, right? It's not just that God exists. God is righteous. And me and my people are not righteous. It's not a struggle between Paro and the Jewish people. It's a struggle between Paro / Mitzrayim and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. After that, it's clear that Paro has accepted the fact that there's HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's a God in the world. And so now, Parshas Bo can start the real job, and the real job is to take us out of Mitzrayim. Right? Parshas Va'era is about recognizing God. Parshas Bo is about taking us out of Mitzrayim. And that's the ultimate goal. So the goal, so when you see it that way, the Makos in Parshas Bo are to break Mitzrayim, to force them to their knees, because otherwise they're not going to let the Jewish people go. And the first Makkah of Arba, even though we don't think of it that way, the point, says the pasuk, is to destroy all remaining food of Mitzrayim, right? No exceptions. Nothing is left. And that's why Paro says to Moshe, this Makkah is death. It's going to be the end of my kingdom, right? So that's true of Arba. Obviously, Choshech is even a bigger Makkah than Arba, and even more disruptive to the economy and to how things work, even without the idea that they couldn't move, right? Even if it was just complete black, complete darkness, sucking away all, like lights don't work. In the Ibn Ezra talks about there are places high in the mountains and places in the sea where the lights just don't work. I assume it's because there's no oxygen. But the point is, if Choshech is an entity, it's not just the absence of light. Like sometimes we ask ourselves, how did the world work at the beginning? When Choshech and Or work together. Well, if there's light, there's no Choshech, right? Isn't Choshech just the absence of light? So no, we generally think, based on the Ramban and other places, and certainly here, we think no, Choshech is something physical, some heaviness that not just blots out the light, but if you attempted to light something during Choshech, because of the lack of oxygen or whatever the problem is, the lights wouldn't work. The candles wouldn't work. It wouldn't illuminate. You're in the dark. Okay, that's difficult. And if that's difficult, obviously, Makas Bechoros, there's no point, there's no need to even expand on how devastating that Makkah would be for Mitzrayim. Okay, now, this transition from Va'era to Bo also explains some other distinctions, right? In Va'era, the Chartumim were a big part of Paro. Paro, each time there was a Makkah, Paro turned to the Chartumim. The Chartumim would try to duplicate the Makkah. Obviously, the Chartumim represent, the scholars or the religious leaders of Mitzrayim in some way. And when Paro needs help, when Paro's in a theological fight with God, so there's a place for the Chartumim. But once that fight is over, once the religious fight is over, so there's no place for them. And who are they replaced by? They're replaced by the Abdei Paro, right? What are Abdei Paro? Meaning the regular people in Egypt. Even the rich people are Abdei Paro. In our vocabulary, it's not just the street, it's the Arab street. It's something we know. It's public opinion. Paro may be an absolute dictator, he may be a despot, he may be all these bad things, but at some point, without the support of his people, his power is going to crumble. And so the people say after Arba, or before Arba, actually, when Moshe threatens them, Vayamru avdei paro elav, ad masai yezalon l'mokesh, shalach et ha'anashim v'yavdu et Adonai Eloheihem, harterem teda ki avda Mitzrayim. Say the people of Egypt, we are lost. They've won. Power, they've won. There's no point in fighting them anymore, right? That's the idea. When you think of, modern day Iran. So do the Ayatollahs, do they really care about what the people think? I don't know enough to know. But they need the people. At some point, without any public support, without any of those people, you're going to fail. And it's almost like, literally the same thing, right? Paro, let the Jews go. Better that the Jews go than we die, right? I think like the people in Iran say, I understand you want to get nuclear weapons, but if nuclear weapons are going to come at the support of my dinner, if I have no drinking water, so forget the nuclear weapons and let's just live a normal life. Okay, so that's one distinction based on the difference between Va'era and Bo. Similarly, because the Makos in Parshas Va'era were not that serious and not that harmful, so Paro, as I mentioned before, could play games with, when do you want me to take the Maka away? Why don't we say tomorrow, right? You didn't feel the rush, you didn't feel the immediacy. But now you have, Vayimaher Paro likro Moshe le'Aaron, Vayomer chatati la'Adonai Elohechem v'lachem, va'atos sana chatati achapam, va'atiu la'Adonai Elohechem v'yosem elai rakat hamavas hazeh. Right? It's bad. I need it to go right now. I can't live any longer with this Makkah. And that's a distinction. And it ends with Makas Bechoros. And here, Moshe says to Paro that it's going to be different this time, that your servants are going to come to call me in the middle of the night to rush me out of Mitzrayim. And the Medrash there says, and Rashi quotes it, Moshe was being nice to Paro. He's being respectful. Because in the end, Paro came in the middle of the night to beg Moshe and Aaron to leave. But it says the Pasuk, V'yardu kol avodacha eile elai v'yishtachavuli le'mor, tzei atov v'chol ha'am asher b'raglecha v'achar chen etzei, v'yetzei me'im Paro b'choriaf. Okay, so it shows the immediacy of getting rid of the Makos in Parshas Bo versus Parshas Vayera. And finally, you come, I think, to the most important distinction, and that you could say is the negotiating style of Moshe Rabbeinu. If we pointed this out last week, if you're a regular Jew and you live in Mitzrayim and you're a slave, and Moshe brings Makav Dam, and Paro says, fine, I'll let you go, and then he takes away the Makav Dam, he brings Tzvadeh, and Paro says, fine, I'll let you go, and he brings Moshe seems like the worst negotiator ever. That's not how you negotiate. If you're a slave, you say to him, let us go, and then you'll take the Makkah away. Why are you giving him what he wants beforehand? There's no incentive to let us go. And the sense you get when you're reading Ba'era is not so much a real negotiation. It's like a conversation. Okay, all things being equal, I'd like this. Doesn't work out for you. We can negotiate. We can compromise. Right? It really feels like a conversation. It doesn't have the anger, the immediacy. If you're involved in a real negotiation, you get invested in it. And it involves insults and it involves, it's frustrating. And you come to this week's parsha, Vayishavet Moshe vet Aaron al Paro, Vayomer alehem l'chu ivdu et Adonai Elohechem mi v'mi aholchem. So Paro's giving in. Who's going to go on? Vayomer Moshe bina areinu uvizikeinenu nelech. Okay, I get it. Bivonenu ubivnotenu. Okay, I get it. Bitsonenu ubivkarenu nelech ki chag Hashem lanu. We're all going. And then Paro gets angry. Vayomer alehem yihichein asher yimachem kasher shalachetchem v'etabchem re'u ki ra neged pneichem. Says Paro, lo chein l'chu hagvarim v'ivdu et Hashem. Fine, the men could go. Ki ota tem makshim v'yigaresh otam eit pnei Paro. Right? Paro chases them out. Paro's invested. Moshe's invested. Right? You feel a sense. And the other thing that's missing here is the 3-day business. It's clear that's been dropped. When Moshe talks to Paro, we're going and we're going forever, right? And then finally, after Choshech, we read, Vayikra Paro Moshe vayom eluchu ibdu et Adonai rach tzonchem v'kechem yutzag gam tabchem yelechim achem. Fine, I'll let you all go. Just leave the livestock. Vayom Moshe Gam ata titein b'yadeinu zvachim v'olot v'asinu l'Hashem Elokeinu. Right? It's really personal now. Moshe says to Paro, not only are we going to take the livestock, you're going to give us livestock, so that we daven for your life from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? That's mean. And then Moshe adds, V'gam miknenu yelechi manu lo tishar parsa. We're not leaving a single suitcase behind. Right? King menu nikach la'avodas Hashem Elokeinu, etc., etc. You could feel the tension now. You could feel the immediacy. You can feel the conflict. And then Vayetze me'im paro b'choriaf. Moshe and Aaron leave in great anger, right? Paro insulted them. Paro said, I'm not going to speak to you again. Moshe knows what's about to happen. And you feel like it's very, very personal. You feel like Moshe has a stake in a negotiation in a way that you didn't feel that way in last week's Parsha. You really didn't. And then finally we get to the Haftara. And the Haftara is similar to last week's in Yechezkel. Haftara starts in Perek Mem Vav of Yirmiyahu. Hadavar shediber Adonai el Yirmiyahu hanavi lavo Nebuchadrezzar melech Bavel la'akot et Eretz Mitzrayim. Right. The historical background is it's around the time of Churban Abayis, and Nebuchadnezzar is God's chosen instrument for carrying out His will, for destroying Mitzrayim, and also, unfortunately, for destroying the Beis Hamikdash and Yerushalayim. But the focus here is on Mitzrayim. And here, when you look in the Haftarah, you see a major distinction from last week. Last week, the metaphor that Yechezkel used to talk about the destruction of Mitzrayim was a tanim, right? Some animal, some crocodile that lives in the Nile. And the point of last week was, over the struggle of whether God exists or not. And so God's going to exile the alligator or the tanim, whatever it is, from the Nile. Is it going to end Mitzrayim? No, it's not. It would be bad for them, I suppose. This animal has been this mythical animal has been in the Nile since the beginning of time. Maybe people worship it, but it's not going to be the end. But the metaphor in this week's parsha is the egel. Says the pasuk, Egla yefei fiyah Mitzrayim karen mitzafon bava. Right, Mitzrayim is identified as the egel, as the calf. Says the next pasuk, Gam sichira b'kirba ke'eglei marbek ki gam hema hifnu nasu yachtav v'lo amadu ki yom edam bo alehem eit pekudatam. Right, a calf is a domesticated animal. It's what you eat for dinner. It's a steak. It's critical to the survival of Mitzrayim. Right, it's not magical. It doesn't rule over anything. It's who we are. It's what we eat. When the egel is kicked out of Mitzrayim, right? When the meat, all the things we consume, it's going to be horrible for Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is going to fail. That's the distinction between last week and this week. And it says the Navi Yirmiyahu at the end of our Haftara, Va'ata al tira abdi Yaakov va'al techat Yisrael ki hineni moshiacha meirachok v'tzaracha me'eretz shivyam v'shav Yaakov v'shakat v'sha'anan ve'ein macharid. Ata al tira abdi Yaakov ne'um Adonai ki itcha ani. Ki e'esech chala b'chol hagoyim asher yidachticha shama v'odcha lo e'esech chala v'yisarticha lamishpat v'nakei lo anakeka. What's going on? It all depends on your perspective. Okay? We're not asking God not to punish us. When we deserve punishment, we should be punished. But we don't want to live in fear. Right? And when God says to us, Al Tira Yaakov, we appreciate it. We're not going to live in fear anymore. And when God says, Va'otcha lo e'esek kala, I'm going to destroy the Gentiles, but you I'm not going to destroy, we should feel a deep appreciation to God. That's God's promise to us in every generation. I will destroy your enemies, but I won't destroy you. I imagine it was extremely hard, maybe even impossible, to thank God after the Holocaust. I know it was extremely hard to thank God after October 7th. But the fact of the matter is that the Jewish people, based on the Navi Yirmiyahu, will endure and will survive. Not only because we deserve it, often we don't deserve it. Our understanding is the Jews in Mitzrayim didn't deserve the Geula, but God had promised Avraham Avinu, right? And so we deserve to go out. And when HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises Yirmiyahu as our representative that he will never destroy us and that he'll keep us going, we feel a deep appreciation for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And maybe that's what Chazal wanted more than anything. They want us to feel that deep appreciation. They want us to relive not the Yitzias Mitzrayim, but the Geula from Mitzrayim. They want us to relive the feeling of appreciation for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's why the Pasuk says, Al tira abdi Yaakov, don't be afraid. Ki itcha ani. Ki aseh kala b'chol hagim, I'll destroy the Gentiles, right? V'otcha lo aseh kala. V'yitzarticha b'mishpat. Okay, when I punish you, I'll punish you. But v'nakeh lo anakeka. But in the end, you're going to survive. And that promise and that hope stays with us all these thousands of years later until, God willing, we see the final redemption. Shabbat Shalom.